But today, what we are going to do is we're going to examine two important subjects in the area of biblical interpretation, what we call the science of biblical interpretation, also known as hermeneutics. And if you're taking notes, we're going to be looking at two distinct topics today. The first one is called typology. The second one that we'll get to is called Christophany, and we'll get there in a moment. But let's start on the subject of typology. Typology is a method of biblical interpretation whereby an element found in the Old Testament is seen to prefigure an element found in the New Testament. Does everyone understand the definition? Typology is the study of types. In the Old Testament, there might be something that represents something that's coming in the New Testament. We call that thing that represents what is coming a type, and whatever it represented we call the anti-type, or the fulfillment of the type. That which was represented in the Old Testament is fulfilled in the New Testament, and there are a myriad of examples, and I want us to look at some. Let's begin by going to 1 Corinthians chapter 10. First Corinthians chapter 10, and you're going to go right to the top of the chapter. If you remember in the Old Testament, when the Hebrew people were traveling in the 40 years of wandering in the wilderness, there came times where they were thirsty and there were not ready sources of water available. So what brought them the water? The Bible says there was a rock, and that from that rock water flowed. Do we all remember this story? There was a time in which later in Moses' life he actually got angry and at the people, not angry at God or angry at the rock, but he got angry at the people, and he smote the rock, and in doing so water came forth, but Moses was punished for that because God did not tell him to smite the rock, but to speak to the rock. And if you ever read that story, it's actually pride is what he got in trouble for, because what he said was, "Shall we bring water from this rock?" And then he smote it. And the issue was the fact that he included himself as one of the ones who was bringing water from the rock. And any one of us who's ever had a moment of pride can relate. He made a mistake, and he received punishment for that. But anyhow, that just reminding of that rock and the situation. Well, in 1 Corinthians chapter 10, this rock is mentioned again. Let's read starting in verse 1. It says, "For I want you to know, brothers, that our fathers were all under the cloud and all passed through the sea." This again speaking of those who went through the Red Sea. Moses had parted the Red Sea and they had gone through. "And all were baptized into Moses." This doesn't mean they had a baptismal service like we did. This simply means that they were immersed into Moses' leadership. That's what the word baptism there means. It means to be immersed. They were immersed into Moses. They were following Moses. And it says they were baptized into Moses in the cloud and in the sea, meaning that they had gone through, they had seen the cloud in the sky, they had gone through the sea, thus they were following after Moses, and all ate of the same spiritual food, and all drank of the same spiritual drink, for they drank from the spiritual rock that followed them. This is that rock that brought the water. And the rock was Christ. Right there, we are told specifically that the rock in the Old Testament was a type of Christ who would fulfill the rock in the New Testament. Now, how did Jesus fulfill the work of the rock? I think one of the greatest examples that I can come up with is in John chapter 4, when Jesus spoke to the lady at the well. Remember, he walked up to the lady at the well, and he says, "Give me something to drink." And she says, "Listen, you're a Jew, I'm a Samaritan. We don't talk like that. What do you mean you're coming and asking me for water?" And Jesus said, "If you knew who it was who speaks to you, you would have asked of him, and he would have given you living water. And he who drinks of this water will never thirst again. You see, Jesus gives life-giving water. Not physical, tangible. And that's what she thought he was talking about. Because what did she say? Give me this water so that I never have to come back to this well and dip again. But the water he was talking about was the water that nourishes the soul. The water that gives life to the dead spirit, brings it back to life and nourishes the spirit. Thus, when it says in 1 Corinthians 10, and the rock was Christ, what it meant was that which the rock did physically. It kept the people alive. It kept their thirsts quenched. It kept them sustained through the wilderness wanderings. That which the rock represented the spiritual work of Christ that was going to come. The work of giving life. Life-giving water. So that's one example of how a type in the Old Testament represented the work of Christ in the New Testament. And the New Testament tells us, we don't have to guess, was the rock a type of Christ? Guess what? It's not up to us to decide. The Bible tells us the rock was Christ. It tells us that the type is fulfilled in the antitype. All right? So let's move on to another one. Go with me to John chapter 6. Do you remember also in the wilderness wanderings there was something that fell from heaven that gave the Israelites food for their stomach? What was that called? Manna. Angel food cake. Yeah. They ate angel food cake for 40 years. No, they had the manna, the bread from heaven. Right? John chapter 6, go to verse 48. Jesus is talking about his body being true bread and his blood true drink. Now we could venture off into the subject of transubstantiation and all the issues that surround that. We're not going there today. If you've been missing the Reformed theology or the history of the Reformation series that Richard's been doing, please come on Sunday night. It's wonderful and you get an opportunity to discuss some of these issues. However, the specific thing here Jesus references is how the manna was a prefiguring of his work. And let's read that starting in verse 48 to verse 51. He says, I am the bread of life. Your fathers ate the manna in the wilderness and they died. This is the bread that comes down from heaven so that one may eat of it and not die. I am the living bread that came down from heaven. If anyone eats of this bread, he will live forever. And the bread that I will give for the life of the world is my flesh. Thus, Jesus compares his work, his flesh, what we take in as when we receive Christ, not physically but spiritually, to the manna. Again, what did manna do? It brought the necessary nourishment to the people who were starving. Jesus said, the manna that came down from heaven, I am the true manna. I am the real manna. That was a type. And it gave you a picture to look at. But now that picture is fulfilled in me.